May 8th, 1945. Church bells rang across America. In New York, strangers embraced beneath a sea of flags. In small towns, children ran through the streets while mothers wiped away tears of relief. The war in Europe was finally over. A day of hope and celebration, remembered simply as Victory in Europe Day. Yet, amid the jubilation, in one quiet corner of Massachusetts, a very different story unfolded. Inside a prisoner of war camp, a group of young German women listened as American commanders announced their freedom. They were free to return home. But what happened next was something no one expected. Instead of celebrating, many of them begged to stay. Why would prisoners choose captivity over freedom? What could possibly make them trade the ruins of their homeland for the uncertainty of remaining with their former enemies? Tonight, we'll retrace their journey. From the cold November morning, when they first stepped into Fort Deans, still wearing fragments of their German uniforms, to the night they gathered together and sang Silent Night in broken English. And how, piece by piece, gestures of kindness and shattering revelations transformed not just their lives, but also how America saw its former enemies. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from tonight? Leave a comment below, and let's see how this story connects us across time and place. Now, let us turn back the clock to November 1944, when the first transport of German women arrived at Fort Deans. A story unlike any other was about to begin. On May 8th, 1945, Americans poured into the streets to celebrate a moment they had prayed for through long, weary years of war. Victory in Europe was more than a military triumph. It was a release of breath, a relief that sons and fathers might finally come home. Photographs from that day show Times Square flooded with flags and confetti, while in small towns, farmers set down their tools just to ring the church bells. But history is never as simple as headlines. Far from the cheering crowds, in a small prisoner of war camp near Fort Deans, Massachusetts, something quietly defied expectations. Here, 60 young German women, captured in the final months of fighting, stood before their American captors. The announcement was clear. They were free to go home. And yet, instead of relief, many of them hesitated. Some even pleaded to stay. At first glance, this seems almost unthinkable. Why would anyone prefer captivity to freedom? But context matters. By May of 1945, much of Germany lay in ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden had been reduced to rubble by years of bombing. Families were scattered, homes destroyed, and news filtering through Red Cross bulletins often brought more grief than comfort. For many of these women, home no longer existed in any recognizable form. America, on the other hand, had become something unexpectedly different. Behind the barbed wire, they found more than barracks. They found routines, meals, and, in rare moments, kindness from the very people they had been taught to hate. The paradox of Fort Deans was not just about choosing between two countries. It was about choosing between despair and the faint possibility of belonging. There is a quiet lesson here, one that still resonates. Sometimes, what we call freedom depends less on geography than on the dignity and hope we find in daily life. For these women, captivity in America offered something their devastated homeland could not: the chance to start again with humanity still intact. And so, the story of Fort Deans begins not with liberation, but with a choice that defied logic. To understand how such a moment became possible, we need to step back into the lives of the women themselves and the roles they once served in Hitler's crumbling Reich. Before we can truly understand the women of Fort Deans, we need to know who they were before the war ended their journey. They were not frontline soldiers, nor hardened ideologues. Most belonged to the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, known in German as the Helferinnen. Created during the war years, these units filled roles that freed men for combat. Some worked as radio operators, tapping out coded messages across crackling lines. Others served as clerks and typists, keeping track of endless paperwork in a bureaucracy built for war. Still others were trained as nurses or medical aides, tending to wounded soldiers on the retreat from France or Belgium. They wore grey uniforms with insignia that signalled pride and duty, but in reality, many were barely older than high school graduates. Take the story of Ingrid Briner, for example. At just 23, she had trained as a communications specialist in Hamburg. To her, joining the Auxiliary Corps in 1943 was not about ideology, but survival. Like many young women of her generation, she believed she was serving her homeland in its darkest hour. When captured, she clutched a small leather diary, the only personal possession she had left, filled with fragments of her old life. It is important to pause here and remember. These women were part of the war machine, yes, but they were also ordinary people swept into extraordinary times. Some believed the propaganda they grew up with. Others simply followed orders, hoping to do their duty and return home one day. Few, if any, imagined their journey would end inside an American camp thousands of miles away. The small lesson their lives offer us is this: history is rarely divided neatly into heroes and villains. Often, it is young men and women, barely adults, who are caught between the world they are told to serve and the reality they discover too late. At Fort Deans, these 60 women arrived in November of 1944, tired, uncertain, still wearing pieces of their faded grey uniforms. They carried with them not only the weight of their country's defeat, but also the unspoken question: how would they be treated here, in the hands of their former enemies? To picture life at Fort Deans, we need to imagine a very different kind of prison. America held over 370,000 German prisoners of war, between 1,942 and 1,946, scattered across camps in Texas, Arizona, and the Midwest. Most were men, captured on the battlefields of North Africa or Europe, and sent across the Atlantic to farms and factories that needed labor. But Fort Deans was different. It was small, almost hidden away in the Massachusetts countryside, and it housed fewer than 60 women, an almost unheard-of arrangement at the time. The camp itself was modest: rows of wooden barracks, a mess hall, a guardhouse, and a patch of land that looked more like a New England farmstead than a battlefield compound. Inside, the women followed strict routines. Mornings began with roll call. Meals were served at long wooden tables, and evenings ended with lights out at 9 o'clock. Compared to the chaos they had left behind in Europe, the camp offered something strange: order and predictability. Their meals were plain but regular. Their beds had clean blankets. Even the latrines, flush toilets and running water were luxuries few of them had seen in months back home. An American farm boy, Private James Morrison, later wrote to his parents, "It feels odd, Ma, but I think these girls are living better here as prisoners than they would in Germany right now. They don't go hungry, and for the first time they look safe." It may seem odd to think of a prison as a refuge, but for these women it was exactly that. The fences kept them inside, yes, but they also kept despair outside. There is a quiet lesson in this. Sometimes the very place we think will confine us ends up giving us the stability we didn't know we needed. Still, the camp was not free from tension. In those first weeks, the German women kept their distance, whispering to one another in hushed voices, avoiding eye contact with guards. They carried themselves with military posture, shoulders straight, eyes forward, as if dignity could be the last shield against uncertainty. It was in this atmosphere of silence and formality that the smallest gestures, an extra blanket, a word of English taught patiently, A smile exchanged across the mess hall would begin to change everything. At first, the women of Fort Deans carried themselves with the stiffness of soldiers. They spoke little, their conversations hushed in German, their eyes averted from the American guards. For them, kindness was not something to be expected, it was something to be doubted. And then, something small happened. Private James Morrison, the Iowa farm boy, noticed that one of the women, a slight blonde named Anna Weber, was coughing at night. The barracks were cold, and winter in Massachusetts was harsher than anything she had known. Quietly, without waiting for permission, Morrison brought her an extra blanket from the supply shed. He brewed a cup of hot tea from herbs his grandmother had taught him about, and left it by her bedside. Anna accepted it with hesitation, but when she whispered "Danke," something shifted. The image of the merciless American enemy she had been taught to believe in cracked just a little. Soon, others followed. Sergeant Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China, began teaching the women basic English phrases. He used chalk on the mess hall wall, drawing pictures of cups, chairs, and windows, inviting them to repeat after him. Laughter broke out when pronunciations stumbled, and slowly the sharp lines of guard and prisoner blurred into something gentler, people trying to understand one another. These were not grand gestures, no treaties were signed, no orders rewritten, just blankets, tea, and chalk on a wall. But they carried a weight that uniforms and barbed wire could not erase. The lesson here is simple yet powerful. History often shifts not on the battlefield, but in the quiet spaces where people choose compassion over indifference. A war that had dehumanized millions was, in this little camp, challenged by something as ordinary and as extraordinary as kindness. And so, when December arrived, and Captain Sullivan faced the question of how to mark Christmas in a camp full of enemy prisoners, those earlier acts of warmth had already planted the seed for what would become a night no one ever forgot. As December settled over Massachusetts, snow blanketed the roofs of Fort Deans. The war in Europe still raged, but inside the small compound, life had taken on its own rhythm. When Christmas approached, Captain Margaret Sullivan faced a dilemma. Should the holiday be ignored, treated as just another day in captivity? Or could it be a chance, perhaps a risky one, for something more? She chose the second path. With modest supplies, she allowed the German women to make simple decorations. Strands of paper garlands, pine branches gathered from nearby woods, a few candles for the mess hall. It wasn't much, but in the cold barracks, it brought a sense of familiarity. Then came a request that no one expected. Ingrid Brenner, the young communications specialist, approached Captain Sullivan. In halting English, she asked if the women might sing first their own Christmas songs, and then, if they were allowed, some American carols they had been practicing. Sullivan agreed. That evening, the mess hall filled with a hush. 60 German women stood before their guards, their voices rising together in O Tannenbaum. The melody was rich, haunting, full of homesickness for places far away. Then, almost shyly, they began Silent Night, this time in English. The words were imperfect, the accents heavy, but the meaning was unmistakable. Private Morrison later wrote to his mother, "Ma, I never thought I'd hear German girls sing our songs. For a moment, I forgot we were enemies. They looked so young, like Sarah and her friends back home. I think that's when it hit me. They were just people, same as us." That night, the walls of the camp seemed to soften. For a few hours, war receded, and what remained was something shared: music, faith, and the longing for peace. The lesson is timeless. Reconciliation often begins not with speeches, but with shared humanity. A familiar song, a melody recognized across borders, can speak where words fail. In the weeks that followed, the camp changed. The women volunteered more readily for kitchen duty, sewing, and even helping with medical tasks. Conversations between guards and prisoners grew easier. And by the time winter turned to spring, Fort Deans had become less a place of confinement and more a place of unexpected community. But the world outside was changing rapidly. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany, terrible truths were coming to light, truths that would shake these women's very sense of who they were and what they had believed. By early 1945, the world beyond the fences of Fort Deans was unraveling. Allied troops were advancing deeper into Germany, and with them came reports that stunned even battle-hardened soldiers. Concentration camps, places most ordinary Germans claimed never to have known, were being uncovered in horrific detail. Inside the camp library, Ingrid Brenner unfolded an American newspaper. The photographs were grainy, but they needed no translation. Skeletal figures behind barbed wire, mass graves, survivors with hollow eyes. Her hands shook as she read the words Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. Names she had never heard before now burned into her memory. Others gathered around, their faces pale. Anna Weber, who had once clung to the belief that she was serving her homeland honorably, whispered in German, "Is this real? Did our country truly do these things?" Tears streamed down her face as silence spread through the room. Captain Sullivan, watching from a distance, recognized this was no ordinary grief. These were young women confronting a devastating collapse of identity. They had thought of themselves as auxiliaries, helpers, daughters of a nation in need. Now they were forced to face the possibility that their service had been tied to atrocities beyond imagination. The lesson here is not only historical, it is profoundly human. Sometimes the deepest wounds are not those inflicted by enemies, but those revealed by truth. It is one thing to lose a war. It is another to realize the ideals you fought for were built on lies. At Fort Deans, this moral shock changed everything. Conversations in German turned into debates filled with anguish. Some women withdrew into silence. Others, like Ingrid, poured their confusion into diary pages late at night, asking questions no one could yet answer. What kind of Germany will we return to? What kind of people have we been? And yet, out of this heartbreak came the stirrings of something unexpected, humility and a longing for redemption. As spring approached, the walls between guards and prisoners continued to thin, not just because of kindness or music, but because both sides now shared a heavy truth about what war reveals. It was in this fragile space, between despair and hope, that the women of Fort Deans began to reach beyond survival. They looked for ways to help, to work, to contribute, not as prisoners fulfilling orders, but as human beings searching for purpose. By the time spring sunlight began to soften the Massachusetts snow, Fort Deans no longer looked or felt quite like a prison. Something subtle but powerful had shifted. The women who once stood apart now moved through the camp with purpose. They were still prisoners by law, but in their daily lives they were becoming part of a small, unlikely community. It began with simple work. Some volunteered in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, scrubbing pots, and learning American recipes from the camp cook. Others, with sewing skills, repaired worn uniforms and patched blankets. Those with medical training assisted the camp nurse, tending to fevers and bandaging sprained ankles. Ingrid Brenner, with her growing command of English, became more than just a translator. She became a bridge. She explained German idioms to curious guards, and in turn helped her fellow prisoners understand American jokes and phrases. Slowly, conversations at mealtimes began to mix German and English, laughter mingling across tables that had once divided us from them. Anna Weber, whose cough had first drawn Morrison's kindness, discovered her gift for care. Working alongside Dr. Hayes, she proved to be a patient and capable assistant. What began as simple tasks, carrying supplies, cleaning instruments, soon grew into more. Taking pulses, preparing bandages, comforting frightened patients. Even the skeptical doctor admitted she had a rare gift for healing. Perhaps most telling were the friendships that extended beyond the wire. Local families, like the Hendersons, visited through church programs. They brought books, taught English phrases, and sometimes even shared recipes. For women far from home, these small gestures of welcome lit a path towards something more than survival. They offered belonging. The lesson here is clear. Dignity is restored not through grand declarations, but through meaningful work, shared language, and human connection. In the act of contributing, these women began to reclaim something war had stolen from them, the sense that they mattered. By late spring, Fort Deans had transformed. It was no longer just a place of confinement. It was a fragile community, built on trust, learning, and small acts of daily grace. But outside those wooden fences, the world was racing toward an ending. Germany was collapsing, and with it came new orders for the prisoners of war. Soon, the women of Fort Deans would face a choice unlike any they had imagined, whether to return home to a shattered country or to ask for something extraordinary. On May 15th, 1945, the women of Fort Deans gathered in the camp's main hall. Captain Sullivan stood before them with papers from Washington in her hands. Her voice was steady as she read the official order. Within 2 weeks, the prisoners would be repatriated to Germany. The war in Europe was over. Their captivity was ending. For most prisoners of war, such an announcement was a moment of joy. But at Fort Deans, silence filled the room. Then, to the astonishment of the guards, Ingrid Brenner rose to her feet. Speaking in careful English, she said softly, "Captain, some of us do not wish to return." One by one, others joined her. Anna Weber, Maria, Greta, and a dozen more. 14 in all. They explained, with trembling voices, why they hesitated to go home. Some had lost their families to bombing raids and had no one to return to. Others feared being branded as traitors, accused of weakness for having been captured. And for many, Germany itself had become unrecognizable, reduced to rubble, haunted by revelations of horrors they had never imagined. Here in America, they had found something fragile but real: dignity, purpose, and the first glimpses of trust in humanity again. To leave that behind felt, to them, like a step back into despair. It was a request without precedent. Prisoners asking not for freedom, but for the right to remain in the country of their captors. To the guards and officers listening, it was almost unthinkable. And yet, in the faces of those women, the sincerity was undeniable. There's a lesson in their choice. Sometimes, courage doesn't look like marching proudly back to what you've known. Sometimes, it looks like admitting you no longer belong there, and daring to choose a new path, even if that path begins in the most unlikely of places. But courage is never free from conflict. Their decisions sparked fierce debate. Among their fellow prisoners, some accused them of cowardice, of turning their backs on duty. Local newspapers questioned whether they deserved sympathy, while American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific. And within the camp itself, even sympathetic guards wondered, were these women seeking redemption or simply running from responsibility? It was a question that would soon draw in voices from outside Fort Deans, voices of clergy, of community leaders, and finally of Washington itself. Captain Sullivan's urgent report traveled quickly up the chain of command. In Washington, officials pored over her words with a mix of curiosity and unease. Never before had German prisoners asked not to go home. By international law specifically, the Geneva Convention, all prisoners of war were to be repatriated without delay once hostilities ended. To deny that would risk setting a dangerous precedent. But here was the dilemma. These women weren't asking for privilege or special treatment. They were asking to stay in a place where, for the first time in years, they had found safety, purpose, and even hope. What did justice mean in such a case? Behind closed doors, policymakers debated. Some argued the law was clear. Send them back, no exceptions. Others pointed to the growing humanitarian crisis in Europe. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless, and refugee camps overflowed. Was it truly just to send these women into that chaos when they had a chance to build something stable in America? A compromise began to take shape. Washington drafted an unprecedented solution. The women could no longer be classified as prisoners of war, but they might be recognized instead as displaced persons. That meant they would not be housed by the military, but if local communities agreed to sponsor them with jobs, housing, and oversight, they could remain in the United States. It was a solution that satisfied neither side completely. Legally, it bent the rules. Emotionally, it forced the women to face a harder truth. If they stayed, they would not simply live behind the comfort of camp fences. They would have to stand on their own, prove their worth, and begin new lives from nothing. The small lesson here is this: freedom is never just the absence of chains. It is the willingness to carry responsibility, to build something that endures, even when the path forward is uncertain. As the orders reached Fort Deans, the women who had begged to stay now faced a sharper choice. Some reconsidered, deciding that the risk of America was greater than the pain of returning to Germany. But others, like Ingrid and Anna, chose to embrace the challenge. They would leave behind the safety of the camp and step into the unknown immigrants in a country that had once been their enemy. And so, on a June morning in 1945, as the buses arrived to begin repatriations, the women of Fort Deans divided into two groups. Some boarded transports bound for Europe. Others stayed behind, clutching letters from American sponsors, hearts filled with both fear and fragile hope. Their journeys would diverge here, but both paths carried lessons that still matter today. In the summer of 1945, the story of Fort Deans seemed to close quietly. Buses rolled out, carrying most of the women back to a broken Germany. Yet for 9 who remained, life was only just beginning. Ingrid Briner found a home with the Henderson family, working as a translator for displaced Europeans arriving on American shores. Her diary, once filled with questions of despair, now recorded the challenges of rebuilding lives across languages and borders. Years later, she would stand before the United Nations, speaking not as a former prisoner, but as an American citizen and a voice for reconciliation. Anna Weber stayed under the guidance of Dr. Hayes, finishing her training as a nurse. Patients remembered her gentle manner, her willingness to sit at a bedside long after the shift had ended. She never married, but dedicated her life to care, believing it was her way of giving back for the kindness once shown to her. Others built quieter lives, marrying American veterans, teaching in small towns, working in hospitals or shops. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years, binding together those who stayed with those who returned. Across the divide of oceans and choices, they carried one shared conviction, that kindness had changed them and that it could change the world they were helping to rebuild. The lesson of Fort Deans is larger than one camp or one group of women. It is that redemption is possible, even for those once called enemies. That dignity, once offered, can create ripples reaching far beyond fences and wars. And that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but in the quiet decision to treat one another as human. Today, their story remains a reminder. In every conflict, in every moment of division, there are chances, small, fragile chances, to build bridges where walls once stood. And as we reflect on the women who chose to stay and those who chose to return, perhaps the question is not which decision was braver, but what both paths teach us. That freedom is not only where you go, but what you choose to do with the life given to you. So when we hear the bells of Victory in Europe Day echo through history, let us remember not only the soldiers in the streets, but also the quiet voices in a Massachusetts camp, voices that once whispered the unthinkable. Please, let us stay.